Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Piano Pedagogy podcast. With me today is Luisa Matthynssens, and she is the founder of Cadenza Studios, which is a private piano studio in Oklahoma City. And she's recently expanded into an online brand that specializes in creating piano repertoire and teaching tools like the newest sound shapes. And that's what we're going to be talking about here today. How are you doing today?
Doing really well. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. I'm excited to dive into exactly how all of these sound shapes work. So for people who aren't familiar, can you just give a brief overview of what sound shapes are?
Yes, so sound shapes are basically magnetic music notation. They're 3D printed. They have a flat back so you can stack them up. We have literally every symbol there is in music, from notes to rest, chords, accidentals. They're really, really handy to have in lessons if you don't want to write out some kind of exercise. You don't want to have your student writing out an exercise, because let's face it, in 30 minutes, writing takes a lot of time. So with these sound shapes, you can just kind of stick them on the board, do whatever kind of exercise that you're needing to do. They come on and off really, really simply.
Gotcha. For those of us who are listening, I would highly encourage you to watch the video version of this episode on YouTube, because I'm sure that Luisa is going to be showing us lots of visuals with her sound shapes. But let's dive in. First, tell us a little bit about your music background. We know that you're a teacher in Oklahoma City, but can you tell us more?
Yes, so I got my bachelor's degree in piano performance and pedagogy. And then a couple years later, I went back to get my master's in collaborative piano and composition. Throughout that whole time, I've been teaching piano lessons. And for the last about 8 years, I've been doing it as my full-time job. I teach kind of rarely, 4-year-olds to about 13-year-olds mainly, but I've taught all the way up to 70 years old.
Awesome. So that is wonderful. 4 to 99. It's. I think that my oldest student was 86, and she was a trooper. She drove herself to her lessons, and she was just awesome. So I think that's great. So the sound shapes. Did you have the 3D printer before you started doing that, or to talk to us a little bit about how you got started with sound shapes?
So my husband's an engineer, and he did have a 3D printer. He had just gotten it. And I had had this idea for quite a long time, but I just had no idea, how to make it happen. I had a student, she was about 5 years old, and she was not getting the staff. It wasn't clicking. Every week we kind of would do the same thing over and over. And when we would do writing exercises, I noticed that she just had a hard time with writing, just in general, her letters, her numbers. And I was like, I need something big for her. I need something that she can just like hold and put on there instead of writing. And so I had that idea. I talked to my husband about it, and, he said, we have a 3D printer. Why don't I kind of design something? So he used some kind of software that's compatible with the 3D printer. I gave him pictures of every single music symbol, and I said, I want it as exact as possible. I've seen other things out there. A quarter note can look a lot of different ways, just a circle and a stick. But I wanted that exact font that music engravers use. So all of the sound shapes are in that exact font that we're all used to seeing. So he took the time and designed them all, and then we took the time to print out a prototype of every single shape, and sound shapes were born.
That's awesome. I think that's really great. Can you tell us how large they are? Because it's hard to get an idea of perspective.
Yeah, so I guess the largest piece is the treble clef, and it's about the size of my hand from middle finger to wrist. And then I guess the whole note would be one of the smaller ones. It's kind of right directly in the middle of my palm, maybe an inch, slightly more than an inch wide, and a few centimeters thick.
Gotcha. Okay. So that gives us some context there. Now, I really love this idea for so many different levels, but I think that my favorite is that the staff is such a non-intuitive thing, right? Some stuff that we do at the piano, very little, honestly, is intuitive, right? Like it looks the way it sounds. Pitch goes up and down, and we read from left to right, but there's very little that's intuitive about the way the staff works. And it can be very difficult for especially young students to wrap their head around it. And I think that for teachers, it can become, we can become desensitized to just how alien these things are, right? As we've been doing them for decades, it's second nature to us, and it can be really stark how we interact with it versus how students interact with it. Have you noticed that?
Definitely. I have my youngest student right now is 5 years old. And I only ever take students that young when they're a sibling of a current student, and we just tack 15 minutes on the sibling lesson. And however long the 5-year-old can focus is fine. And then the sibling will take the rest of the time.
Oh, I love that.
So it's a really great method. And then you end up getting a 30-minute student in a few years.
That's awesome. I love that. Yeah.
So this student, we were just starting to read on the staff. And, we always start with the middle C. And he was doing great. Like he was reading pieces where it was kind of just all one note, middle C, and he would play it. And then we'd introduce D, and he could play the C and D pieces. But then when I wanted him to write it or place it on the staff, he was all over the place. So like, for example, I have a middle C shape that comes with the ledger line on it. So it's for those young kids. They can see middle C is its own thing. It has its own thing to it. And I would ask him to put middle C where it goes. And he just kind of would put it anywhere. Like every time it was a completely different place. So even though he could read the music and he was playing the right notes at the right time, he didn't understand that the placement on the staff is what makes it the note. And so every week we work with him on it. We put middle C where it goes. And actually one of the beginner activities that I do on the staff is just placing clefs, just so they have a sense that there's like exact locations on the staff. So we take the treble clef and we'll put it so that the loop is sitting on that bottom line. And I like to say that these are the little legs hanging off the ledge, like it's sitting on a wall or something. And then we'll do our bass clef. I'll point out that its head is kind of hitting the ceiling. And then, of course, our 2 dots are in the 2 spaces. And what I'll have them do is I say, okay, I want you to take a mental picture of this. And when you're ready, take off all the pieces, close your eyes for 5 seconds, and then put them on exactly how they were. And, with the younger students, we have to do that a few times so they understand it is pretty exact. It's not just putting it in a random spot. But the older kids, they do it first try, no problem.
That what you just said sparked something in that, especially with young children, there is nothing as precise as staff reading in their life. And I think that for most people, nothing requires the level of precision that the staff is, right? If you write a letter slightly higher than another letter, it still means that letter, but we're using the same symbol. And when you place it in a slightly different position, it takes on an entirely new meaning.
Yes. And with the same student, he had his lesson on Monday, and that's exactly what we talked about in his lesson. Because I wasn't understanding where the disconnect was. And finally, I realized, he's seeing 2 quarter notes, and I'm calling one D and one E, and it wasn't clicking to him. So finally, we talked about it's where it is that matters, and we practiced putting a D and putting an E. And we would just do it over and over, take it off, put it on. And I would make sure it would be in the exact location. And then eventually, he was putting them in the right spot every time.
I like to use the terminology with young kids. I ask, like, where does D live, right? Like thinking about, they all look the same, but because they're living in different places on the staff, they end up meaning different things. But I don't know why it didn't click with me that this is a task that requires a level of precision seen nowhere else. And with these young students, when you're asking them to draw something, I mean, a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 7, I mean, even a 9-year-old, they're still learning decent handwriting. And then we throw them in and we teach them new symbols that they've never seen before. And we're like, oh yeah, by the way, you need to be perfect with it. Otherwise you're wrong.
Right. It's very difficult for them. Have you noticed whenever kids are writing maybe like a whole note on the staff, it'll take up maybe like 3 or 4 to 5 note places like this?
Yeah.
That
Yeah,
kind of,
especially I think it's more noticeable with the line notes rather than the space notes, right? Because the space notes, they have an outer boundary.
right.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I think I'm going to have to think more about that whole precision thing. And it makes sense. We give them larger staffs to write on, and we do those kinds of things. But I really enjoy that. I have something similar, I suppose. Little felt magnetic. They don't hold up well. Little like quarter note shapes and half notes and whatnot. They don't hold up well. And I love things that students can manipulate in their hand. And this is young children, right? Because when they hold something in their hand, if they can hold a quarter note, right, they understand just so much more about the way it's shaped and the way that it is. What it is, right? They touch everything that they experience. And I love that your sound shapes allow students to touch the staff. And I wanted to refer back to something you said about the treble clef and the bass clef, because I think that the clefs are one of the things that teachers underestimate the most about the difficulty, right? Especially because it's something that students never really interact with. I mean, some theory books, like little kid theory books and obviously older theory books, will have students draw the clefs, but eventually, like, they're just like, okay, that's it. You're done interacting with that thing. Now you just look at it, and it kind of stops being real, if it ever really was real. And I love that helps with that so much. At what point do you introduce the idea of the treble clef and the bass clef? Do you do off staff reading with black keys, or just with like the note heads having the names filled in?
Yeah, I do that. I actually created my own method. The first 2 books are off staff. Level 1 or level A is black keys, level B is white keys. And you learn everything from measure numbers, bar lines, double hand reading. And then finally in level C, you get to the staff. So you understand everything about music except the staff. That way, when you're reading the staff, that's the only new thing you're encountering.
I love that. I love that. I think that as piano pedagogy has evolved over the last 50 years, right? 50, I suppose more like 70 years now, when pedagogy really started being a thing in the United States. I look back, I have a book from my great aunt when she was learning, and there's a page that gives the entire grand staff from the low G up to the high G, and then they're using 16th notes on the next page. And I think it's so funny how, as time goes on, we're getting less and less. Our expectations are lower, but not in a bad way. Like we're expecting, like, I told you this thing, that all of this, you got to remember this. Now do it, right? So I love off staff. I love black keys. I really love that stage with a student. With my students, I often do a lot of no book stuff in the first couple weeks before even opening their books, because they need to learn how to use their hands, and they don't need to know all of this all at once, right? And I love that you break it down to that extent, because it is just such a the staff is such a monumental concept.
It is. I like doing improvisation before we even look at any books. So you can work on the hand shape without even having to read something. You're just looking at your hand the whole time.
Yeah, and they can make great music, right? They can make something that sounds fun, that's complicated, and they're not constrained. Yeah. But let me refocus us here. on what we're here to talk about. Otherwise, we'll just go forever. So we talked about. I wanted to refer back to, you said the middle C with the line. Do you teach middle? I saw that. I think I've seen in your set that you have both the middle C with the line, and then you also have the ledger line as a separate piece. Do you teach middle C as something that comes with its own line?
I do, for young beginners anyway. I feel like introducing ledger lines, like for what they are at that point, is just too much information. And they need something really easy to remember. And so to know that this one note is the special looking note, I think that's enough for that beginner stage. That way they have some bearings on the staff.
Gotcha. So that it's its own kind of landmark. I enjoy that because I've never considered. I've always talked about that middle C needs its own line because we ran out of room on the staff. But I like the idea that it comes with its own line. Now, as we are talking about the sound shapes, can you tell us a little bit about the way that you use it in everyday lesson with a student?
So last September, I went on maternity leave. So I took 3 months off, and each student had like 1 or 2 lessons during that time. And so we just started back on Monday, just our regular full schedule. And I had one student who was kind of fresh on the staff right before we took our break. And so I kind of assumed that he would have forgotten most of how things worked. And I was right. So what I wanted to kind of test his knowledge. I gave him some music to sight read, and he, couldn't really read it accurately. So I wanted to start from square one without feeling like he was starting from square one. So no book assignment. Instead, we went to the board, and I just asked him, let's just put some notes in order by step. So I gave him the starting note, and I said, okay, we're just going to put our whole notes in order, line, space, line, space. And so he started to do it. And then eventually he got off track and the notes started skipping. So that told me like he is not quite understanding the line space structure when it comes to note stepping on the keyboard. So, we tried again, and, he's 10, so he got it pretty quickly. And so we got to the point where he was consistently getting it correct, putting the notes in order by step, going up or down. So then what we would do, I said, okay, well, now this is an E that I gave you. I want you to put these 5 whole notes in order going up by step from this E, and tell me what note you landed on at the top. So then he would, count the letters, he would tell me, and then we would go to the piano and we would play starting from the E, going up 5 notes. And so he could have that recognition that when the notes are going higher on the staff, they're also going higher on the piano. So then eventually what I did, I would have him, start from a different note and tell him to go down with 4 notes or something. He would tell me the ending letter name, and then I would take away the middle one. So, in this case, I started with a C, and my ending note is a lower G. So it's down a 4th. And so then I would ask him to visualize all those notes in between, and then have him name the note that we ended on. That way he's starting to see distance a little bit more, but he's still using the motion of steps to kind of figure out what the note is. So yes, we can memorize face and every good boy does fine, which I really don't like those. They always get it mixed up. But
I hate mnemonics. I've ranted a long time about the mnemonics on this podcast. So I'm in complete agreement with you.
Honestly, though, as a kid, they worked for me, but I just don't believe in them nowadays.
Yeah, you're teaching a way to remember. You have to remember this thing, and then you use that thing to remember the notes instead of just skipping that middle step and just teaching, like guide notes or landmark notes or some other method. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I liked about what this activity I just described is he's understanding like why that's a B, why that's an A. It's not just some random thing to memorize. Yes, you kind of have to know 1 or 2 or 3 to get you to that right answer. But, he was very used to middle C. He was confident with that, and he was starting to count up from middle C. But of course, I don't know if you've run into this. people know middle C really well, and then they forget D. They kind of forget that that is a note place when it comes to going.
Yes, actually, I have a student who is just a couple of days ago, we came back from our winter break, and the space between middle C and E evaporated. I've also wondered, like, what would a method of teaching D before we teach middle C? Like, what's so darn special about middle C that it needs to be introduced first? Because it's a kind of a tricky concept, right? That this note is the same key on the piano, and we use it. It can look two different ways. It's still the same thing. And D would make more sense to me to be the first note that a student would learn.
D is the first white key that I teach on the piano because it's easiest to spot in between those two.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, and that's true too. Because it's in between the two black keys, so it could just be the first note on the staff as well. My mentor from university tells me that at every point, a piano teacher in her career, she's going to sit down and she's going to be like, I should write a method book series so that I can just do all of the things that I think this method book does wrong, and I can do it better. Sounds like you actually went and did that. What was that experience like for you?
It was a little bit tedious to do the off-staff things. I used Finale, like rest in peace Finale. I don't know how the other software is when it comes to that, but it took a long time. But what I had already was a lot of pieces I had created in lessons. I had my computer set up, I had a printer. So I would just create like some real basic stuff for my beginners who needed that extra couple weeks on one concept. Because, Faber, you learn one note, next week you learn another note, next week you learn another. Sometimes they needed to breathe in between notes. So I would create random pieces. So I already had a lot of content, and it was just a matter of ordering it and filling in the gaps.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's awesome. I've always thought about it, and as I get further along in my career, I pull in other things and I cut out things, and I've stopped being so beholden to the method book and the way the method book does things. My keyboard geography exercises, I've often skipped straight to in the Faber book, using C, D, E, F, and G, and kind of skipping right past the way they introduce it because I just do it on an off book kind of way. Anyway, it's interesting because as a teacher grows in confidence, they're willing to venture out, color outside of the lines, so to speak. Now, with the sound shapes, have you noticed an increase in fluency or an increase in the ease of learning certain things?
Definitely. I've noticed it sticks a little bit better. I have one student who I mentioned earlier who kind of had forgotten about the staff. We were, before we took that break, it was very accelerated for him. Honestly, he was about 2 months reading in the staff. So we didn't get too far, and, 3 months off after 2 months of learning, hard to keep that stuff in. But
yeah, the math doesn't really work, does it?
Exactly. But, he did, he was able to, I think we got up to learning all of the right hand lines and spaces, and he was able to read music very fluently, right hand full staff, just, not just C position, which we typically do for the first however long you're reading music.
Gotcha. Now, I was, as I'm looking at your staff board behind you, I was curious, have you ever considered breaking the staff down in a similar way that you've broken the notes down, and having the students, instead of starting with the staff, starting with nothing, and having them construct the staff in the same way you're having them do that with the rest of your sound shapes?
The back of this board is just totally blank. So you can have them draw a staff. What I do with the blank side is do lots of rhythm, especially with students who are not reading on the staff. It doesn't make sense to put notes on the staff to study rhythm with them. I also, this is great for practicing drawing a treble clef if you do want to do that in a lesson. I had a beginner student I handed him the treble clef and said, hold this with your right hand, handed him the bass clef, hold this with your left hand.
I love that.
It was fun. He liked it. And then we put him on the board, on the right side and the left side. And then I traced his hands. We numbered the finger numbers. And then we played a little game. I put the board in front of him as a reference. He was very young. I think he's 6, maybe. And I would say treble clef, finger 2. And his job was just to use the right hand and finger and play any piano key he wanted. So we did that a few times. And then by doing that, he's learning clefs, he's learning finger numbers, he's solidifying his knowledge of right and left, which we know is not really solid.
Easy. Yep.
Either.
Now, I noticed that you have a specific set for rhythm. You have your staff fundamentals, and then you have a rhythm set. Can you talk a little bit about the ways that you use your rhythm set?
Yes, so the rhythm set is going to have 8th notes, 16th notes, and it also has beams so that you can create your own, multi-beamed notes. The basic set, it does have a set of 8th notes and it does have some beams. But if you're teaching advanced students, if you're doing a music theory class, maybe as a college professor or even a high school teacher with music theory, where you're getting into 16th notes and the more complicated rhythm, it gives you all the possibilities. 16th notes are the smallest note value, but it does come with little tiny bars, so you could turn them into 32nd notes, 64th, or because it's on dry erase board, you could just add in the lines as you see fit with a dry erase marker. So it's just a little bit more all-encompassing than the basic set.
An activity that I had just thought of with rhythm is prevailing pedagogy is that we should really emphasize patterns, right? And rhythm patterns is one of those things that I really emphasize with my students. Can we find this to measure rhythm pattern, and where else in this piece is it, et cetera? Do you ever have rhythm patterns with the sound shapes in relation to what's happening in a piece, or is it usually something that you keep separate?
We used this last week. I have a student working on, I think it's a piece by Stephen Heller. And she had one measure. She came to me, she said, okay, I do not understand this rhythm at all. It's in 6/8 time, but how do I count the 16th note? And so I had her, I gave her all the notes that were present in that measure. I gave her all the pieces. And I said, I want you to just construct that measure on the board. So she copied it down. And then we went through and we wrote the beats. Because in her score, think of the Schirmer editions. It's all squished together, hard to read. Anything in there, it's like a jumbled mess. So writing the beats wasn't going to work. There was no room to write them. So we took that measure out, blew it up essentially, made it big, wrote the beats, and then we worked with that rhythm until she could feel it, understand it. And then she didn't really need to write it in her music because she could play the rhythm perfectly at that point. So it's really great for reconstructing something in the piece that's not understood, but making it big instead of having to write it big. Filling in a quarter note takes forever.
Right. Yeah. And it uses a lot of marker ink.
Exactly. That too. So it's a really great way to just quickly blow up a measure. Kind of like if you had an iPad, you would zoom way in on it.
Right. Now, do you use this mostly with children, or is this something that you can also use with adults?
You can use it with adults. Right now, I don't have many adult students that this would really apply to. They're kind of on their own path and they choose to do. And, I would love to use it more with them, but that's just kind of not the path we're on currently with them.
So your studio mostly has younger students and your adult students aren't really in this realm. Gotcha. You have mentioned doing it with advanced students, right? Can you give some examples of some activities that you can use sound shapes with advanced students?
Definitely. So with the advanced students, we mostly focus on the chords. And, let me flip this board back real quick. I wanted the chords to be their own entity so that you could actually manipulate their shapes. Because as pianists, we're thinking shapes when we see it. And so I have, in the chord package, there's all the types of chords from triads to sevens to, the basic 3-note 7 chord that you start with in the dominant form. But I have to start, I have the chord inversions here. And what I'll do is, let's see, let's make this accurate. And you can see right here. Exactly. I need my ledger line here. And I really like this ledger line feature. It took me a long time to figure out how we would do that because I knew you would need to add ledger lines at some point.
Right.
So the chord inversions is a great one because, once your kids start seeing chords in music, they kind of freak out like, oh my gosh, there's 3 notes all of a sudden. What is that? So just by handing them the notes and telling them, okay, these are the 3 shapes you're going to see. There's just 3. You can see this is your basic one. Your root position triad. You can play that in your sleep. But then the other 2 options, the fourth is either on top or on the bottom. And just like that alone makes it so much easier. They can think, oh, it's a fourth and a third. That's it. Not anything crazier than that. And then I do have the octave chords, the 4-note chords. So this is for the even more advanced students who are reading music or they're expanding their hands all the way to the octave. If they see this in their music, they might kind of hesitate. F major octave chord. But just by holding it and seeing that there's really only 3 variations of an octave chord, it takes the fear out a little bit. Because they know they have 3 options. They know their root, first and second inversion chords. It's just a matter of what shape is this? Where's my root? And then they can read it no problem.
Now, I'm curious if you mostly consider this a convenience thing of not having to use a marker, not having to draw, or do you think that it fundamentally is a different teaching approach?
I think it's a little of both, but I think ultimately it is a teaching tool. We talked about how the staff is precise. It's very visual. There is some oral aspect in that you play what you see, but there's not really the kinesthetic part or the tactile for the staff. And this provides that tactile learning. And the more senses that you can incorporate in an experience, the better the learning outcome is going to be.
Right. Yeah. So you're thinking that this brings in that feel, which, is just completely lacking in most piano education.
Exactly. Like with the half note and the whole note, there's the hole in the middle, and kids love to just put it around their finger. And that just kind of solidifies, there's nothing in the middle of this. It's open. It's different than the quarter note where you physically would not be able to put your finger through. So with some kids, this is what they really need. They want to feel it. They want to touch it. They want to examine it up close instead of just this random symbol on a page. And there's a million other things on the page to look at. So this kind of isolates the concept.
Gotcha. Now, I'm curious if this approach completely sidesteps some of the issues that come when students are drawing it. Now, do you have your students draw these symbols as well, or do they exclusively interact with your sound shapes?
I do mostly do this, but I know it is really important to also be able to write it. So we do incorporate that. But I only incorporate the writing after I am for sure they know where to place it, because the erasing and the rewriting and the erasing, it takes time. It gets frustrating. The page gets all messy. So once they get to paper, I want it to be an extremely successful experience for them. And we can even use the whiteboard to do it.
Right. I've noticed that when students draw quarter notes, for example, that the direction of stems, right? For many early method books, stem direction is used to convey right hand versus left hand, because it's true enough for the notes in the area around middle C. And, we do so much stuff where it's like, this is true enough now. And, when it changes, it's far enough from now that, you're not going to have an issue with it. When it comes time for like a student to draw a quarter note, do they ever mix up which side the stem goes on?
Always, every time. With these, there's magnets on one side, so if they're trying to put it on, they physically can't. I know it's different when you're writing, but it'll fall off. What I do for them though is, and I'm not sure that this is as obvious when it's on paper. I just take the quarter note and I flip it down like this.
I love that activity. I have students build their own quarter note. I give them a stem and a head separately, and then they love. I'm like, okay, now I'm going to brain teaser for you. Without touching the note, can you turn it into a left-handed note? And they're like, I can't. Well, what if you moved? If you moved the board, could you do it without touching the note itself? To understand that it's not so much, I think of it at the stem, it's not so much that the stem moves so much as the entire note rotates, which is what you just demonstrated on the board up there.
Yeah, definitely. But I do get some kids that still, they're not exactly sure where to put the stem, and some kids are better at that than others, and just remembering that visualization on what it looks like and where it is.
Now, another thing I'm curious about is the stems. The length of these stems is already predetermined, and that is in itself, different engravers use different lengths. Some do a sixth, some do an octave. So which one did you decide on? How long are your stems?
I've never considered that. It was whatever the default finale had. So let's find out. It takes up the full length. So how would you measure that? What would you call that?
I usually call it a seventh. I usually think like it's a seventh, that the stem should go about a seventh. But obviously a student doesn't know what a seventh is when they're first learning it, which is what my question is. Do you notice that when it does come time for them to start drawing them, do you get the short little stubs, or are they like appropriately sized with the stems because they've been seeing them and interacting with them so long? Or do you still get the stubs?
Well, it's kind of a mixture, actually. I have some kids that just write really tiny for whatever. And so like they'll draw, a space note. It takes up half the thing. But when they do that, I'll just put a whole note right next to it. How big it is. It needs to face. So, people.
So we always have the sound shapes to refer back to as a model.
Yeah, exactly. And it takes 1 second to just show it, and they can see it right away. And then the problem is fixed right away.
Gotcha. I love that. I think that's fantastic. Now, do you think that when you first started doing the sound shapes, that it required a shift in your teaching style, or was it more that you were like, finally, like I don't need to be like using all of these tiny pieces of paper that have quarter notes on them and have a big style? Like, was it a natural evolution, or was it something that was like, I'm going to try this new thing?
It definitely was a finally moment. I had been wanting something like this for a really long time. It did take some kind of effort to remember, like, oh yeah, I can do this now. And I kind of built up my mental library of activities that I can do with these. Eventually, I want to start a video series of, activities that you can do. And I've kind of started this on my Instagram at Cadenza Studios. But there's just so many things you can do. And most of the things that I do with my students, I just think of on the fly. And you can just kind of build your own exercise and game as you go. It's really easy to kind of backtrack or undo something.
That was actually my next question for you. If say a teacher, loves the idea of your sound shapes and they have the big box of them, what can they do to get started once they have that, right? Because I'm sure you have this, like you said, you have this rich library to pull from. What are some things they can do to get started with it?
Well, it depends on, the level of student that they
say an elementary student that's just starting with the staff.
Okay. I would just have them take out whole notes, the clefs, maybe some quarter notes too, and just practice, building pentascales, building broken triads. In their lesson, they could just, say they're learning a piece. Are you familiar with the Faber series?
I am familiar with the Piano Adventures. It's the primary book that I use.
Yeah, same. So you could pull out maybe 1 to 2 measures from that book and then try to recreate that using the shape, just so you can kind of get used to, locating it, finding it, putting it up really quickly, and kind of getting fast at it, I would say. And then you can also have your students do the same. There's always a measure that the student is doing some error in. That's why they're in lessons, to get better.
Right.
You can take that one measure and have them just copy it on the board. And that's a really good place to start. Just copying the music that you see, recreating it on the staff. You can do, if you're learning skips, you can have them play skips all on the lines or all on the spaces. There's endless possibilities.
And something that I had just considered is I have a nonverbal autistic student, and it can be challenging because I can't understand what he's thinking. I have to kind of guess what he's thinking because he doesn't use his words to communicate what he's thinking. And I often wonder if we see things in the same way, because I have a magnet board with a staff printed on it already, and a bass clef and a treble clef printed on it already, and I have little circular magnets. And sometimes when I ask him, like, let's put that note there on the board, and then we just, it seems like we're looking at two completely different things, because he puts he'll put like an E, the lowest note on the treble staff, and he'll put it like somewhere completely different. And I wonder if the magnet board is just, it's a context, it is a different context, right? Because it's there's no shape, like the note shapes are different. This is just these round magnets. I wonder if that would, reconstructing the measure would be an easier way for us to communicate about the music, because he'd be able to touch and manipulate it, and it would look the way it does in his music.
Yes, and that's why I wanted the font the same, because I've seen similar things, and it's like, well, this student is already struggling to understand this concept. Why am I going to show them something that looks different to teach them something they're struggling to understand? So the fact that it is exactly the same, just bigger, I think really helps a lot. And then you can kind of guide the placement, and then having that correction the first time for some is enough. And then they never make that mistake again, because there was just some missing element that's hard to talk about because we're just looking at this paper, not touching it. It's small. It's hard to kind of grasp what they're seeing. Like you said, we see something completely different.
Now, I'm curious about the application of using this to kind of, something I do in my teaching is I like to see bits of knowledge, so that when we get to that aha moment, that they already basically knew most of the little pieces, but now it's just all kind of come together, right? When a teacher turns a page, it's like, today we're going to learn about the treble clef, the bass clef, the grand staff, and you've never seen any of this before. Here's like, it's harkening back to like the 50s, right? When here, like all of this stuff, right? So I don't ever want them to turn the page and see something that's completely unfamiliar. For example, with the treble clef and the bass clef, for weeks before they are using the staff, they're drawing in a treble clef near the right-hand part in their music, and they're drawing in a bass clef near the left-hand part of their music. Because I think it's outrageous that the first time they see the treble clef, it's like the week that they have a piece when they need to be using the treble clef. So I was curious if that's something that you identify with.
Definitely. It's a lot of information all at once in these books, and I get why they do it, but it can be overwhelming to students.
So, follow-up question: Do you use the sound shapes in that kind of way, in a way that, because I can tell that you appreciate the different like taking things and separating them out into one concept, something that's multiple concepts. So I'm curious, do you think that your sound shapes lend themselves well to someone trying to prepare students for things before they show up in their books?
Definitely. Something I like to do, I like to make it a little bit magical. Say we're learning the quarter rest, and we do our usual beginning of the lesson things, and then when it's time to introduce the new thing, I'll say, okay, I want you to hold this. And then I'll give them the quarter rest. And they kind of look at it and they're just like, what is this? And on the back, it actually says what it is, by the way. So they'll usually look at the back and say, oh, quarter rest, what's that? So they can feel this symbol. I love giving them the weird shaped ones because they their attention. And when we're doing harmonic intervals, seconds and thirds, I love the interval set because, it's clearly different. The second is always the one that stands out, but it kind of goes over their head a little bit, like why. So I have harmonic seconds and thirds here that I'm holding. And a lot of the times they don't really understand, like, well, why are they side by side? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And so what I'll do is I'll take two whole notes and I'll try to recreate this harmonic second with whole notes, stacking them together. And, it's not going to work. If I let go, it's going to fall off. They overlap. They have to be side by side so that you can read each note. So whatever symbol, whatever concept we're about to learn, I always give them the shape first so they can examine it. We can talk about it, play with it even, and then we can work with it.
Gotcha. Yeah. As you were talking about the quarter rest, I realized that one of the activities that I do to prepare for the quarter rest is that I take a piece that they're already learning and I'll replace one of their notes with a quarter rest and ask them to kind of talk about, well, what did you notice sounded different, right? And that's the extent of that activity that week. And then the next week, we do it again, we go a little bit more in depth. But I love that the culmination of that activity could be them putting down on the board one of the measures that we're working with, that we're manipulating, and then removing the quarter note themselves with their hands and replacing it with a quarter rest. And then we talk about what this weird shaped thing is. And I think that's just, as I'm talking to you, I realize that a lot of the things that I already do could be far, I think, improved through the use of the sound shapes to augment it. I have literal stacks of tiny pieces of paper with like a quarter note drawn on it and, a half note drawn on it. Like, and that, I mean, it's, and every now and then I'll have to make an entirely new stack because I've lost my other stack of little tiny papers. And I just, as I'm talking to you, I'm realizing that there's a lot of potential for your tools to just kind of integrate into what I'm already doing.
Definitely. I really liked that idea. I think I'm going to use that in my lessons where you take out the note and put the rest. It's brilliant.
Thank you. Yeah, that's one of the prep. I actually, for those listening, what I'm referring to is preparation stage teaching, where a student is learning something, but they don't even really realize what they're learning until it all culminates. And then by the time they get to that quarter rest in their book, there's no friction. There's no, how does this work? There's no, I'm going home and I don't really feel good about the quarter rest because they already know it. They learned it in 30-second chunks over the last 3 weeks. So in the show notes for this episode, I will link that other episode. It's one of the oldest ones that we've done. I think it actually might have been the very first episode where I talked about preparation stage learning. But I think there's a lot of potential here for that. Now, does your set come with stems or bar lines or lines? To build a half note and understand that the half note comes from, you just take a stem off the half note and you're left with a whole note?
It does not come with stems, but it comes with beams, which
in size roughly.
Exactly. In doing this, I've noticed that the whole note actually is it's bigger, it's wider than the other notes, which I had never really considered before. So to answer your question, yes, you could build a half note using a whole note. It might look a little different.
Right.
But you could build it in that way.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's and actually I didn't well I've always known that it's shaped a little bit differently, and sometimes actually I admonish my students when they start, like, instead of writing a whole note on a page, I notice them drawing it, and they're like trying to be a printer, right? Like they're trying to replicate the precise. I'm like, we just use a circle when we draw it. We don't need to get it to be this oval shape. Like, we get it. We get to be a little easier. You don't write like you see in the book, so we don't write music that way as well. But I think that's wonderful. Now, I think we're on the wrapping up portion of this episode. But where can teachers learn more about your sound shapes and purchase them?
I'm at cadenzstudios.net. You can see all the sets, and you can even build a custom set. So on the website, there is a parts listing. It lists every single part, and you can just pick and choose and make your own set if that's what you prefer, or there's several kits that are already made for you. And if you check out Cadenza Studios on Instagram, there's lots of different ideas on how you can use them.
Gotcha. So yeah, we'll have links to all of those things. We'll have links to your website. We'll have links to your Instagram on the show notes, which you can get on the Defined Music Teacher blog, and we will definitely have that. So let's start wrapping up, and I just want to put a big picture thing here and say that this doesn't seem like it requires a large shift, at least in the way that I teach, right? I was really interested going into this episode about what kinds of things you used them for and how you integrated them into your teaching. I wasn't entirely convinced, but as we've been talking, I've been convinced. So it seems that all of the things I'm already doing and a lot of the philosophies that I already have are part of the philosophy behind the creation of these. So it doesn't require a major shift in the way that I teach, because first of all, it's so open-ended. You can use them in so many different ways, and they just slot into existing activities and augment things. And I really like how they bring in that feeling component, because it is so lacking. And some students really, really learn that way, right? Hands-on learners, they like going up to touch a frog instead of learning what a frog is, right? And there's staff notation is this intangible thing that you can't really touch, right? So I love how this takes the intangible kind of just lines and it turns it into something that students can touch, they can hold in their hand, and they can manipulate. And I think that is just wonderful. Any last thoughts, Luisa?
I really appreciate you having me on. I did want to say I listened to the last episode you did, and we have started thinking of themes for our year in my studio. So I wanted to thank you for that idea.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, those of you who haven't listened to the yearly themes, it was a little mini episode I published at the beginning of the year, and the idea is to set your intentions for the upcoming year, not only for your students who might need to focus on a particular thing during their practice, but also as a teacher. So maybe if you're looking for a new theme, something to focus your teaching for 2025, sound shapes can be your theme. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Piano Pedagogy Podcast, and I will see you next time.